August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. One bomb. Hiroshima erased from the map. 3 days later, the sky burned again. By the end of 1945, over 200,000 people were dead. Radiation lingered in the air. Human shadows were seared into concrete. Survivors carried burns that never healed. Children were born with deformities. Entire bloodlines vanished in seconds. If any nation in modern history had a reason to nurture permanent hatred, it would be Japan. And yet today, nearly 80 years later, more than 70% of Japanese hold a favorable view of the United States. The two nations are bound by a security treaty. Over 50,000 American troops are stationed on Japanese soil. If Japan were attacked, the United States would be obligated to respond. So here is the question: why Japan doesn't hate the US for the nuclear attacks? Before Hiroshima, the United States and Japan were not historical enemies. Their relationship began with pressure, but evolved into strategic modernization, not colonial domination. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan to open its ports after more than 2 centuries of isolation. In much of Asia, that kind of encounter led to colonization. In Japan, it triggered transformation. Rather than becoming a Western colony, Japan chose to modernize on its own terms. From 1868 to 1912, and during the Meiji Restoration, Japan dismantled its feudal system, built a centralized state, constructed over 7,000 kilometers of railway by 1900, and multiplied industrial output nearly 5-fold before World War I. It studied Western institutions, including those of the United States, not out of admiration alone, but out of necessity. China had been humiliated in the Opium Wars. India was under British rule. Japan understood the lesson: modernize or be dominated. By 1905, Japan defeated Russia, the first Asian nation to defeat a European empire in modern warfare. President Theodore Roosevelt mediated the peace treaty, signaling mutual recognition rather than hostility. During World War I, Japan and the United States fought on the same side. Trade deepened, and by the late 1930s, nearly 80% of Japan's oil imports came from the United States. For American audiences, this context matters. The US never ruled Japan the way Britain ruled India. There was no century of occupation, no colonial extraction. Japan modernized to compete in a world shaped by Western power, not to destroy America. Hatred was not the starting point. The path to 1945 emerged from strategic rivalry between two expanding industrial powers, not from ancient resentment. The war between the United States and Japan did not begin with hatred. It began with a resource problem. By 1940, Japan had transformed itself into a modern industrial power, but it lacked the raw materials to sustain that power. It had almost no domestic oil production. Yet oil was the lifeblood of modern warfare. Battleships, aircraft carriers, fighter planes, trucks, factories, all of it depended on fuel. And nearly 80% of Japan's oil imports came from the United States. That dependence was not just economic, it was strategic vulnerability. To escape that vulnerability, Japan expanded. In 1931, it seized Manchuria, securing coal and industrial capacity. In 1937, it launched a full-scale invasion of China, committing more than 1 million troops in what became a grinding, expensive war. But expansion required more fuel, more steel, more rubber, resources Japan still lacked. Meanwhile, the United States supported the open-door policy in China. No single power should dominate the region. Trade should remain accessible to all. Japan's approach was different. It sought direct territorial control, a defensive empire designed to secure its own supply lines and reduce reliance on Western powers. The turning point came in 1941, when Japan moved into French Indochina, positioning itself closer to the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Washington responded with economic force. The United States froze Japanese assets and imposed an oil embargo, cutting off roughly 90% of Japan's external oil supply. Japanese planners calculated that their reserves would last about 18 months under wartime conditions. At that moment, Tokyo faced a narrowing set of choices: withdraw from China and accept American demands, effectively abandoning years of military expansion, or move south to seize oil fields, knowing this would likely trigger war with the United States. Pearl Harbor was the result of that dilemma. Japanese leaders believed that a surprise attack could cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough to secure Southeast Asia and build a defensive perimeter. They did not expect to defeat the United States outright. They expected to shock it into negotiation. The calculation was strategic, but fatally flawed. Japan underestimated the scale of American industrial capacity. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year and launching ships at a pace Japan could not match. What Tokyo hoped would be a short war became a war of attrition against a manufacturing superpower. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. In a single flash, Hiroshima stopped functioning. The temperature at the hypocenter reached several thousand degrees Celsius. Buildings collapsed. Human bodies were vaporized. By the end of 1945, approximately 140,000 people were dead, from blast, burns, and radiation exposure that continued to claim lives for months. 3 days later, on August 9th, Nagasaki was struck. Another detonation, another shockwave, another city broken apart. By the end of that year, and roughly 70,000 more people had died. Long-term estimates placed the combined death toll between 200,000 and 250,000. The destruction was immediate, overwhelming, and unlike anything the world had seen. A single aircraft could now erase an urban center. But by August 1945, Japan was already collapsing under sustained assault. Between 1944 and 1945, American conventional bombing had killed an estimated 300,000 Japanese civilians. In March 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo created a firestorm so intense that about 100,000 people died in one night. Over 1 million were left homeless. Entire districts were reduced to ash. By mid-1945, more than 60 Japanese cities had been heavily damaged or destroyed. Industrial output had fallen dramatically. Transportation networks were crippled. The Navy was largely sunk. The Air Force was depleted. Food shortages were spreading across the country. As Japan was not a stable nation suddenly shattered by nuclear weapons. It was an exhausted empire under total war. The atomic bombs did not introduce mass civilian destruction. They concentrated it. They accelerated it. They signaled that the threshold of warfare had shifted permanently. They were not the beginning of devastation. They were its peak. If the bombs ended the war, the occupation determined whether hatred would last. From 1945 to 1952, Japan was occupied under General Douglas MacArthur. Historically, defeated nations are often punished, divided, or exploited. Germany was partitioned. Colonies were stripped of resources. Humiliation usually breeds long-term resentment. Japan's case was different. The country was not divided into rival zones. It was not dismantled territorially. There was no American colonial governor extracting wealth. Instead of crushing Japan, the U.S. chose to restructure it. In 1947, a new constitution transformed Japan into a parliamentary democracy. Women gained the right to vote. And in the first post-war election in 1946, over 13 million women participated. The military leadership was dismantled. Around 200,000 officials and military figures were purged from public office to remove militarist influence. Land reform redistributed property from large landlords to nearly 3 million tenant farmers, weakening the old elite power structure. Major industrial conglomerates were reorganized. Labor unions were legalized, and by 1949, union membership reached nearly 6.7 million workers. At the same time, the United States sent massive food aid to prevent famine during severe shortages in 1946 to 47. Education was reformed. Political prisoners were released. Civil liberties were expanded. Japan was not left broken. It was rebuilt. Psychologically, this mattered. Defeat followed by humiliation hardens anger. Defeat followed by stability and rising living standards shifts perception. The United States did not treat Japan as a permanently defeated enemy. It treated it as a state to be stabilized, democratized, and eventually integrated into the global order. The bombs ended the war. The reconstruction changed how the war was remembered. And that distinction would shape the next 80 years. If the occupation reshaped Japan's political system, Article 9 reshaped its national direction. Embedded in the 1947 Constitution was a clause unlike anything seen in modern statecraft. Japan formally renounced war as a sovereign right and pledged not to maintain military forces for purposes of aggression. In a century defined by arms races and ideological blocs, Japan chose a radically different path. Rather than rebuilding itself as a conventional military power, it anchored its post-war identity in economic reconstruction. The structural consequences were profound. For decades, Japan informally capped defense spending at around 1% of GDP, a fraction of what major powers typically allocate. While other nations poured resources into armies, global bases, and weapons systems, Japan directed capital toward education, industrial policy, infrastructure, and technological innovation. Like the security umbrella provided by the United States allowed Tokyo to focus inward, stabilizing society and accelerating growth without bearing the full cost of strategic deterrence. The results were historic. By 1968, just 23 years after Hiroshima, Japan had become the second largest economy in the world. During the 1980s, Japanese firms dominated global markets in automobiles, semiconductors, and consumer electronics. Toyota reshaped manufacturing efficiency. Sony redefined consumer technology. Japanese exports flowed into American households, even as American security guarantees underwrote Japanese stability. From the ruins of 1945 emerged not a remilitarized state, but an economic superpower. This transformation quietly reshaped collective memory. The United States remained the country that dropped the bombs. That fact never disappeared from Japan's historical consciousness, but it was also the country that guaranteed Japan's security, all opened its markets to Japanese exports, and supported its reintegration into the global economy. Hiroshima marked the end of Imperial Japan. Article 9 helped make possible the Japan that followed, and over time, prosperity softened what destruction alone might have hardened. If Reconstruction reshaped Japan internally, the Cold War reshaped its external role. In 1949, Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. In 1950, the Korean War erupted just across the sea. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence across Eastern Europe and projecting power into Northeast Asia. Suddenly, the strategic map of the region had shifted dramatically. For the United States, Japan was no longer merely a defeated enemy to manage. It was the most industrialized, stable territory in East Asia, and therefore the natural anchor of American strategy in the Pacific. Japan became a forward base. American troops remained. Military installations expanded. During the Korean War, U.S. forces used Japan as a logistical hub, and the conflict unexpectedly jump-started Japan's economy through procurement contracts that revitalized factories and shipyards. In 1960, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty formalized the arrangement. The United States would defend Japan if attacked, and in return, American forces would maintain bases on Japanese soil. That treaty remains in effect today. Currently, around 54,000 U.S. military personnel are stationed in Japan, the largest concentration of American troops in any foreign country. Bases in Okinawa, Yokosuka, and elsewhere form a central pillar of U.S. power projection in Asia. As China rises again in the 21st century, economically, technologically, and militarily, this alliance has only grown tighter. Shared concerns over maritime security, Taiwan, and regional stability reinforce the partnership. Over time, the strategic logic became clear. Both nations benefited. Japan received security without massive military spending. The United States gained a stable, advanced ally at the heart of East Asia. In that environment, memory did not disappear, but it was reframed. The relationship was no longer defined by 1945 alone. It was defined by decades of shared security interests, economic integration, and mutual strategic dependence. In international politics, interests compound over time, and eventually, present-day alignment can outweigh even the most painful past. Beyond geopolitics and economics, there is a quieter reason Japan did not convert trauma into permanent hatred. It redefined responsibility. After the war, the Tokyo trials, 1946 to 1948, prosecuted 28 top leaders for war crimes. 7 were executed. Many others received life sentences. In parallel, during the occupation, roughly 200,000 military officers and ultranationalist officials were removed from public office. The narrative that emerged was clear. The catastrophe was driven by a militarist regime, not by the collective will of ordinary citizens. At the same time, Emperor Hirohito remained, but transformed. Under the 1947 Constitution, he became a symbolic figurehead with no governing power. Sovereignty shifted to the people. Japan's identity was no longer imperial and expansionist, but democratic and civilian-led. This institutional break created psychological distance, as if post-war Japan could look at pre-1945 Japan almost as a different political system, one that had made disastrous strategic choices, invading China, attacking Pearl Harbor, confronting a vastly larger industrial power, and where responsibility became internally complex, not externally simplified. Public opinion gradually reflected this shift. Surveys over decades have shown consistently high favorability toward the United States, often above 70% in modern polling, even as remembrance of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains solemn and central to national identity. The bombings are remembered as tragedy and warning, not as a call for revenge. This distinction matters. When defeat is followed by humiliation and stagnation, resentment hardens. When defeat is followed by democratization, rising living standards, and 4 generations without war, memory evolves differently. Japan did not forget 1945, but it reframed it as the end of militarism, not the beginning of permanent hostility, and that reframing made coexistence possible. Japan does not forget Hiroshima. It does not erase Nagasaki. The memory remains solemn, institutionalized, and central to its post-war identity. But memory and state behavior are not the same thing. International relations do not operate on emotion alone. They operate on structure, incentives, and the decisions made after violence ends. Wars destroy. What follows determines whether hatred hardens or transforms. The decisive question is not whether Japan had reasons to resent the United States. It clearly did. The more important question is this: what did the United States choose to do after winning? Instead of permanent punishment, it chose reconstruction. Instead of fragmentation, it chose stability. Instead of humiliation, it chose integration. Over time, that choice reshaped perception. History records the destruction of 1945, but alliances are built on what happens after the destruction stops.